Okay, since the Motorola TV didn't work out so well, I thought I'd pull out something that stands a better chance of surviving. We have torn apart on the bench a Newcomb model P12C 3-speed classroom record player from 1958. This is actually a fairly obscure record player, and it's one of their baby models, if you will. What I mean by baby models is this amp is actually a series string amp, meaning it does not use a power transformer. Has a 50C5 for the output tube, 35W4 rectifier, and 12AV6 for the audio driver stage. But still a decent quality low-powered amplifier. This record player would be good for smaller classrooms. Actually, most of Newcomb's record players had a power transformer based amp with at least a 6V6 single-ended 6V6 output stage. In fact, some of them had push-pull audio output stages. The only other Newcomb record player that I recall seeing that didn't use a power transformer was I can't remember the model number of it now, maybe AV7 I think, but I believe it used a couple of 25L6s in push-pull with a 6AV6 driver tube and solid state rectifier. Wasn't a whole lot to be done to this amp. I replaced the electrolytic capacitors. The original 4-section filter capacitor can showed a high ESR on the capacitance tester. All the resistors check okay, and there was one paper capacitor that had to be replaced, the cap of death that connects between B- and the chassis itself. And here's that capacitor right here, a tiny chief plastic cased paper cap. It was a little leaky. So yeah, I didn't do anything to this amp that you haven't seen me do before. So now let's look at the drive mechanism. I believe this one's going to be a little bit different than what you're used to seeing in my videos. In previous videos, the record players that we've worked on use the type of drive mechanism where the motor shaft was stepped, and they used one single drive wheel, and the way they obtain the different speeds is by positioning the drive wheel either up or down to make contact with the appropriate step on the motor shaft. Well, this setup's a little bit different. This is an older type setup. Our motor shaft is all the same diameter. It's not stepped, but we have 3 rubber turret wheels here, all different diameter. And when you flip it to 33, it places that turret into place. When you flip it to 78, it places that turret into place. And 45 places that turret into place, and whatever turret happens to be in position drives this main wheel, which drives the turntable. Well, cleaning one of these drive mechanisms is really no different than the more modern drive mechanism that you've seen me work on. You just have to pay attention to where everything goes and take your time and, don't lose any of the parts. So the first thing I'll do is remove this idler wheel, and that's accomplished by removing this little clip here. And we'll take that off and clean it up real good and use the specially approved non-vaginal phonograph lubrication to re-lubricate the thing. Here's the idler wheel removed. I've already applied a coating of rubber renew to it. We'll let it sit a while and then wipe the residue off. One of the main disadvantages to this type of drive system is economical. Today, no one makes these idler wheels and these drive turrets. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, I could still get these idler wheels from the local parts house for $5 or $6. Well, today the only option is to send the wheel off and have it rebuilt, and that's about $30. And I think each one of these speed turrets is probably around $20 each to have them rebuilt. So if all of this ends up being bad, see, that's 20, 40, 60, that's $90 that you're looking at just to have all the rubber rebuilt. Whereas if you had a newer type system that only used the rubber drive wheel without the turrets, you're only looking at $30. But hopefully we can salvage these parts and not have to have everything rebuilt. I feel like we can. The main issues that these turrets suffer from, and the wheel, is people leaving the speed selector in gear while the record player is not being used, and after it sits unused for a while, the turrets and or the drive wheel can develop a notch which causes a bump 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 sound as the platter rotates. So word of caution, if your record player has a neutral position or an off position on the speed lever, keep it in the off position or neutral position when not in use. If it doesn't have an off position or neutral position and the mechanism is not set up so the wheel retracts when the machine is off, just turn the player on every so often, at least once or twice a week, and just let it run for a few minutes, and that should keep your idler wheel healthy. Or if nothing else, just once a day turn it on for a couple of seconds to move the idler wheel out of position so it won't be sitting in the same spot all the time. I think we'll be able to salvage this wheel. The rubber renew really helped on it. It's nice and grippy now, and it's not all glazed up, so maybe we can hold off on spending that $30 right now. Okay, now I'll take a Q-tip and clean up around the center hole of the wheel and clean out the inside of the hole here. Get it all nice and clean. And with an alcohol dipped Q-tip, you can see what came out, kind of cruddy. Next, I'd like to remove the motor, and that's accomplished by removing these 3 flathead screws here. And then once we get the motor out, we'll take it apart, clean it, and lubricate it, and then we'll replace these rubber cone-shaped motor mounting grommets. Here's our motor assembly removed, and in order to remove the actual motor, you need to remove these 3 screws that actually hold the motor to the rest of the drive assembly. In order to access one of these screws, you need to get this turret assembly out of the way. And this piece is removed by just simply removing this screw here, and then the whole turret assembly will lift off and give you access to the other screw that holds the motor in. Here's what holds the turret assembly in place. This screw, this washer, and this nut that goes up under the underside of the drive mechanism. You want to make sure not to lose any of that. And now that the turret assembly is positioned out of the way, I can now remove these 3 bolts that hold the motor in place. Here's the motor removed, and notice the assortment of lock washers and bolts and nuts. One lock washer wants to be stubborn and stay on the bottom bearing assembly, which is fine, but just make sure not to lose it. Now we can take the motor apart, clean the bearings out with alcohol and a Q-tip, and re-lubricate them with the zoom spout, and it ought to run good for another 50 some odd years. Now we need to remove this slider assembly to clean it, and the way that's accomplished is dismounting this spring as well as unclipping this little clip here, and then it should just lift off and we can clean it and put a light layer of lubriplate on it, and that part should be good to go at that point. And I don't have to tell you to be careful removing that little clip, because it can easily fly across the room on you, and if that happens, then you might say some words that are not fit for kids to hear. Well, I thought I was going to actually have to clean off my workbench to find the specially approved lubrication, but I remembered I had the specially approved lubrication in another another location, so I didn't have to clean off the workbench. I really don't want to do this today. I should enter this next time the Antique Radio Forum has a messiest workbench contest. I should enter this photo. But anyway, back to the record player. A couple of pointers I want to go over before I proceed with this. You see on this assembly here we have 3 turrets. Now if you need to send these turrets off to have them rebuilt or to clean them or whatever, they're fairly simple to remove. Actually, they just snap into place. You can either just pull them off by, obviously you have to hold this piece with one hand and pull the turret off with the other hand. They just snap into place. Or in the case of these turrets, they were a little bit more difficult to remove, so I just took a small screwdriver and gently pried them up until they snapped loose. Then I pulled them off, cleaned them with the rubber renew, put a small amount of oil on the shaft that they rotate on, and then I just snap them back down into place. You might have to bump them into place with a screwdriver to where they'll snap, but that's all there is to that. And lubricating our motor, obviously you have to take it apart and clean it all out good with rubbing alcohol. In really crusty situations, you can soak the bearings in something like lighter fluid. I might have said lacquer thinner earlier, but now that I think about it, that might not be a very good idea to use something that potent, because it could destroy the felt wicks inside the motor bearing assembly. Then once I clean everything, I like to put a drop of oil on the actual bearing itself, and then you'll notice a little hole here on the bottom bearing assembly as well as one on the top bearing assembly. I apply a few drops of zoom spout oil. This stuff here, this is a lightweight non-detergent turbine oil that's good for these kind of motors. Above all, you don't want to use the red 3-in-1 stuff. That oil has a detergent in it that will gum up your motor, and you certainly don't want to use WD-40. You want to use some kind of lightweight non-detergent oil, this stuff, or perhaps the blue 3-in-1 oil that's meant for motors. And then as you're putting the motor back together, you want to, as you're tightening the bolts down, you want to tap on it to align the bearings. Just tap on each side of the motor with the butt end of a screwdriver. You want to make sure this rotor turns freely here. So I guess that's about all you need to know. I'll now apply some lubricant to this slider piece here, both sides. Not much lubricant, just a small coating. Put a little drop of oil here, and we'll put this back on. Put the little clip back on, and that stage of the refurbishment will be complete. There's the motor back together, running just fine. The only noise you're hearing is it vibrating on my workbench. Let it run a while to let the lubrication work its way in the bearings, and then we'll proceed with the rest of this procedure. Okay, here's our drive mechanism back together and almost ready to be reinstalled onto the motor board. There's 33. Now that 33 RPM turret has a little bit of a dent in it, so that one will eventually need to be rebuilt. Neutral, 78. That one's fairly quiet. And 45. And it's got a slight bit of a noise problem, but that one's not too bad. You know, if this was something I was doing for a customer that was willing to pay big bucks to have it restored, I'd have all of this rubber rebuilt and be done with it. Okay, we're not quite ready to put it back onto the motor board yet. There's a couple other things I need to do. I need to remove this spindle here, and that's accomplished by removing this clip right there and pulling out the spindle and cleaning out the spindle well, and then re-lubricating it with the white lithium grease. I also want to replace the cartridge in here. I think this originally had an old crystal cartridge that was about half dead when I got this. However, I think I'm going to install an Astatic 89T PowerPoint cartridge, since I think I have one of those on hand. However, in the future, I'm going to have to look into another cartridge alternative, because 89Ts are getting scarce and expensive. I remember back up in the 90s, up until the early 2000s, I could buy 89Ts for about $6. Well, now they're about $25, and that's for new old stock ones. And since those are a plug-in needle cartridge assembly, when the needle goes bad, you're back to paying $25 for another one, if you can even find one. Well, there is a slight problem. Those cartridges put out about 1.3 volts. The current Varco TN4 equivalent stereo cartridges only put out about a half a volt, and you wouldn't think that much difference would matter, but it does. The Varco cartridges will actually work, but the volume will be much weaker and the tonal quality won't be as good. You know, I found that out the hard way. However, there is a cartridge that I'm looking into. Gary at the Voice of Music, www.thevoiceofmusic.com, has some mono tetrad cartridges. I don't know if these are new production or new old stock, but they are mono tetrad cartridges that he says put out a conservative output of 0.75 volts. And he lists those as being a replacement for the Astatic 89T and other older ceramic cartridges that put out a volt or a volt and a half. Now, if that cartridge will work, I like that idea much better, because when the needle goes bad, you can spend $5 on a new needle and you're back in business. You're not paying $25 for a new cartridge. You know, back in the old days, the 89T cartridges were a very economical way to go, because you could just unplug the old cartridge and pop a new one in for about $5 or $6. But now that they're 25 and up, they're not so economical anymore. Okay, we have the motor assembly reinstalled. We have the 89T cartridge bracket installed in the tone arm. Now, one last thing you don't want to overlook: always clean the inside rim of your turntable with rubbing alcohol. That'll remove any dirt or oil deposits that could cause the turntable platter to slip. Everything needs to grip as best as it possibly can with this drive wheel. So now we're about ready to install this back in the cabinet. Put the amplifier back in, hook everything up, and see if we can play a record. Here's our case and our spring-mounted speaker. Now, unlike most of these, you just remove the motor board and the whole amp and everything comes out. Well, this one's a little different. In order to get this apart, you first unscrew the motor board, then you remove the knobs, then you lift off the motor board, and the amp remains screwed to these braces right here, which had come loose and had to be re-glued. So we first remount our amp here, and then we connect everything up and then reinstall the motor board. Well, I'm glad I checked the amp before I put it all back together, because we're getting no buzz, nothing out of the speaker. So now let's tear back into it and see what's going on with this amplifier. Okay, I found the problem, and it's my fault. Dodo me forgot to unsolder the B+ input of the output transformer from this main filter capacitor. That's the only lead I forgot to move. Well, we're back together, but I'm going to have to do some work to the tone arm, because it's kind of tilted to one side, and the needle selector lever is scraping the record and not allowing the stylus to make contact with the record groove. Okay, I think I've discovered the problem. It's not the tone arm that's tilted, because when it's on the rest, you can see that it's perfectly flat. It's actually this cartridge holder that's the I don't think this is going to pick it up very well, but if you can follow me here, there's a little bit of gaposis between the top of the needle lever and the tone arm, as in the needle lever is tilted down a little bit when it's on the LP side. Therefore, it's tilting down just enough to touch the record and keep the stylus from making proper contact with the groove. However, if I flip it over to the 78 RPM side, the needle lever is straight like it should be, so therefore it's not coming in contact with the record groove. And the only way I know to fix that is to either come up with a good 89T cartridge holder or upgrade the cartridge to something else, and I've already explained to you the problems that can be. If I were to upgrade the cartridge, I'd try one of Gary Stork's new tetrad mono cartridges that are supposed to put out close to a volt, and maybe that would sufficiently drive the amplifier in this set. Okay, for the time being, I cheated. I just whacked off the stylus flipper, and that way it'll play a record without the stylus flipper dragging on the record surface. So in the near future, I'll either order a good 89T cartridge holder that's not sprung, or I'll order a more modern cartridge and give it a try. But right now, this is what we've got. And I also probably need to ground this tone arm. Now for a 45, as you can hear, the 45 speed setting is quiet. It's just the 33 that's a little noisy from that bad turret. 78's not bad. But yeah, basically all I need to do this is have the 33 RPM turret rebuilt and replace this cartridge holder. And I might ground the tone arm. It was never grounded from the factory, but I don't like this popping and static noise that it makes whenever you touch it or move it. Now for a 78, and yes, the stylus is set to the correct one.
It don't hurt anymore. All my teardrops are dried. No more walking the floor with that burning inside.
I'll leave you with some Andy Williams Christmas music here. Hope you enjoyed it.
It's the most
more to come later.
Time of the year, with the kids singing